Hello survivors and welcome to Reserve Tank, a Metroid podcast by Resident Evil fans for Resident Evil fans. This is First Aids for a bonus episode 15, and ahead of the first brand new entry in 19 years, in this edition we land on the surface and make our way into the bowels of an alien world in our look back on the Super Nintendo classic, Super Metroid. I'm your host Cy, and joining me on Zebes this week, my very own Metroid amiibo bounty hunter from Cereal Box 64, it's Jordan Sugru.
Hi folks.
In space, no one can hear you spam the X-ray scope at every single wall. It's Fire Button Steve Valance.
Guilty as charged.
Of course. And I don't have any more fancy intros because I've been too distracted by the Super Metroid original soundtrack. Sorry, nonetheless, from Steamforge Games, it's Sherwin Matthews.
He's lying, he doesn't like me very much. That's why I don't get a cool intro.
The subject of this bonus episode, like all others, was voted on by our Patreon backers. Support the show now to not only keep us afloat, but to also create new content, select what that content is, and hear it 1 month before everyone else. Tiers begin at just $1 a month. Check out patreon.com/FASprayPod for the full breakdown. So as with always on our bonus episodes, we like to break things up with a little bit of music. As I just previously mentioned, the Super Metroid original soundtrack is a classic. I think we can get that out of the way now. There's a lot to choose from. We've got a very special one this time. A piece of music from a YouTuber by the name of Glassys. That's Glassys. He do lots of covers of video game themes. Has done lots of Metroid themes, but in particular, this particular one is a remix featuring T-Pain. I'm not kidding. This is the first episode of First Aids Bro featuring T-Pain. So look out for Glassys featuring T-Pain covering a Super Metroid piece to break up a discussion of this episode. Yes, look forward to that. It's going to be something very special indeed. So we are here to talk about this SNES classic that we've been not desperate to talk about, but it's come up quite a few times. It's been on many polls and it's come close every single time. It's been on our sort of bucket list, our pile of shame episodes, and it missed the cut a couple of times. And it was on our Nintendo poll and it didn't quite make it. But I think we should just do it anyway. And also, let's just be straight, with the hype around Metroid Dread coming out very soon, and of course Super Metroid just turned 25 this year as well. It just seemed like a good timing to talk about this game. Just get it out of the way. We want to do it, and I'm certain there are plenty of people out there that want to hear it as well. So, Super Metroid was released on March 19th, 1994 for the first time in Japan, April 18th the same year in the US, and July 28th in PAL. As I said, that makes it 25 this year, no matter where you are. It released 25 years ago in your region. It was written and directed by the Metroid figurehead Yoshio Sakamoto, who we were just talking off mic, has had his hand in pretty much every 2D Metroid game and also other M as well. The staff was managed by Nintendo legend Gunpei Yokoi, and the staff was comprised of a mere 15 people. How games development has changed in the last 25 years. It was developed over a period of 2 years after a year-long pre-production and pitching period to Nintendo, and released coming up on 10 years after the original game. It received pretty good reception when it came out, let's put it that way. Lots of 90% to 9 out of 10s. Edge gave it out 8 out of 10. EGM gave it 36 out of 40. GameSpot 8.5 out of 10. IGN gave it 9.5 out of 10. So on and so forth. On game rankings, it has a aggregate score of 97%. And even many years after its release, it still goes down in many lists of the greatest game of all time. Again, IGN ranked it as third out of 100 games, the top third game in 2003, the top 10 in 2005, and then back down to 7 in 2007. And their readers also put it in 11 in their top games of all time in 2005, and 4th in 2006. So even 10 years plus after its release, it's still getting in that top 10, often top 5 spot. And I imagine that's probably pretty accurate even 15 years since then as well. So let's all talk about, first of all, our first experience with Super Metroid. Jordan, I'm going to start with you because, of course, we can now sort of peel back the curtain. This was your pile of shame poll option when we started, much to the reaction of many of us going, really? You've never played Super Metroid? So, of course, this is your first time playing Super Metroid. What was your previous Metroid experience like before then?
Well, yeah. First of all, cat's out of the bag now. This was my choice, and I don't know why nobody went with Super Metroid. Why no poll went with Super Metroid? Because, just as a message to you, the listener, apparently you wanted Heavy Rain more than you wanted Super Metroid. Now, I didn't mention it at the time, but it hurt me a little bit that you wanted to go with a David Cage story rather than, one of the best 16-bit games of all time. But no, I don't take it personally. Don't take it personally. We're finally here. Whether you like it or not, you're gonna have to hear a podcast about one of the best games ever. But yeah, I mean, this is first time playing it, and to be honest, with Metroid, largely I was blocked off by the first sort of NES Metroid. It was kind of hard to get into. I tried playing it a number of times, and this is like the password version. So, when you died, you got a password, which it's fine. You can continue your progress, but it does derail it somewhat compared to, say, like save games, which is quite easy. You just jump straight back into the action, and I didn't have the patience for it as a kid. So I tried that many times, and then eventually what actually kind of warmed me back to giving Metroid another shot was actually Castlevania. Because I played Symphony of the Night, and I said, wow, this is one of the best games ever. It's fantastic, and this very heavily borrowed from Super Metroid especially. So why am I not playing Metroid? And I think with Super Metroid in particular, it was kind of a case of, this is so good, this is such a sort of an amazing experience that I almost have to pick the right time, and I could never sort of pick the right time, find the right time to do it, and then just out of nowhere one day I started playing Metroid Zero Mission, and it went from a sort of like, I just got a new Game Boy Advance screen, setting, and I was like, right, let's have 5 minutes on Metroid. These very colourful games, they look great. Played it for 5 minutes, and then I just did a whole playthrough. From that day, carrying on to the next day. And then a week later, I did Metroid 2, the Game Boy original one. And that was it. All of a sudden, I'm suddenly hooked on Metroid. And it just so happens this year that they've announced a new one. So, obviously, this has been a pile of shame pick for a while. For as long as we've ran the fan polls for our pile of shame picks. So I've been desperate to actually, get around to covering this on the podcast, and obviously using it as a great excuse to play it. So yeah, this is where I'm at now. And coming off the back of that, and then going into Fusion and then Dread in October.
Excellent. I think we're all very excited to hear a fresh opinion on Super Metroid, someone who's played it this year for the first time. Someone who I wager played it a long time ago. Sherwin, do you remember your first experiences with, Metroid in general, but Super Metroid specifically?
No, I played, you're right about playing it 1,000 years ago when the world was young. So I played the original Metroid on my NES, and I just wasn't of a level, bearing in mind I was quite young, I wasn't able to play it through to any real sense of conclusion. It's a really old school punishing game. Like, you start off with 30 health, for example. Like, you don't even start off with full health in this game or anything, and it was really not, it was grim. And I just wasn't really there to actually be able to play it. And I must admit, I put it down and sort of didn't really get along with it for whatever reason. And then Super Metroid came out, and I have no idea to this day how it is that I end up getting Super Metroid. I really don't. But I remember playing it for one evening, sitting down one Saturday night, and just started playing it. And then next thing I looked up, and it's like 2 in the morning, where I've been so engrossed in playing this game. And yeah, it's just, it's one of those genre-defining games, and something which that game that we all talk about every so often called Resident Evil borrowed heavily from in some areas, which I'm sure we'll get onto as this goes on. And yeah, it's just this is absolutely without doubt a game that I go back to every so often. I mean, I remember normally, actually weirdly, this is my normal game for, it was on my 3DS and it is now on my Switch, is my game for plane flights. Whenever I'm flying to like the States or anything for a show or something, I play Super Metroid and blast through, because it's just about the right length where you can really sink your teeth into it and then actually just play it through for a whole bunch of time because you're sitting still for like 8 hours or whatever. And yeah, it's just a really, really solid game. I've got nothing else to say. Do you know what? The best praise I can give it, this game is so good, it's almost as good as Resident Evil Gaiden. That's how good this game is.
Okay. Sorry, I got some hyperbole of my own, don't you worry.
I
Steve.
think you might have lifted that quote directly from Nintendo Power back in the day.
Yeah.
I think so.
That was the sub-headline. Steve, do you remember your first experiences with Super Metroid?
Loosely, it was on my older brother's SNES, and we got the big box copy with the big manual, and I used to pore over that like strategy guide / manual over and over and over again before I finally had my own crack at the game. And I was scared. Like the opening bit, you know, the ominous music and the pitch blue or pitch black and blue room. It generally it tickled the darker parts of my brain, which you know, as a kid, I think put me off it for a while. But I eventually powered through, and upon powering through, it became one of those games that you just keep picking and playing. Like the early SNES era for Steve was, let's keep, you know, hot swapping between Super Metroid, Link to the Past, Mario World 2, and just you know, just keep tripling through them. So it became a very well tread bit of ground after that initial like barrier of fear. I know Steve's scared of strange things, like, you know, sounds and a little ominous little chirp in the distance. Yeah, it left an impact on me. You know, I like everyone else has said so far, a level of nostalgia maybe, but there's a landmarkness to it, and it still gets regular plays from me. Like not every plane flight to America like Sherwin does, but yeah, it's a long haul game for me, and as a result, you know, I think the only other game series that has stood its test of time probably is the RE games for me, in my, you know, nostalgia and stuff.
So, I obviously said before in a previous podcast that my first Nintendo home console was the GameCube. So, the first time I played Super Metroid, I would wager maybe there was some sort of sneaky emulation at some point, I don't know. But the first time I actually sat down in front of a TV to try and really, but the thing about emulation, it's so easy just to swap and change game that I don't know if I would have put any time into it particularly. But I do remember sitting down and playing it on the Wii, because it's one of those games that, as Sherwin has pointed out, playing it on the 3DS and stuff like that, it is almost kind of synonymous with the virtual console, at least for me, thing that Nintendo have done since the Wii generation. It came out on the Wii Virtual Console in 2007. And then the Wii U in 2013. It's been on the 3DS, and now, of course, it's part of Nintendo Switch Online, Nintendo's online paid service. I struggle to call it paid; it's so cheap. But they give you all those SNES games for free as part of that service, and this, of course, is on there. So it's just one of those games that I've got on I think pretty much all of those consoles. I've got it every single time. So yeah, the first time I would have played it was sort of in my sort of late teens. I went through a period of just kind of disinterest in current gaming landscape and trends a little bit, and sort of thought, you know, this is a chance to look back on some things. So around that time, that's kind of when I discovered, again, Castlevania, which we've talked about previously, Mega Man, I became a little bit synonymous with for a while, and yeah, probably the Metroid games as well. So yeah, that would have been the first time I played it, and I have, yeah, similarly, it's just one of those games that every few years I'll pick up, even just for a little bit. It's just so easy to boot up and jump straight back down onto the surface and make your way down. Yeah, there's something very timelessly wonderful about it, and we will start to break that down. I guess the first place the most important place to start is gameplay, of course. As we genre defining has been the phrase. It's in the genre name, as it's known now, the Metroidvania style. Sometimes search and find is what it's called as well. Steve, how do you feel about the core gameplay loop of Metroid? Because you said there something that I think, first of all, what a brilliant selection of games to be playing on rotation on the SNES. But Super Metroid is nothing like either of those games. And honestly, of course, you know, it's a second sequel. It's the third game in the series. But there was still, I think, nothing quite like this on home console at the time.
The closest parallel game I had to it at the time was probably Super Turrican, and that's like a run and gunner where you could turn into a ball, but that's about where the similarities really end. You know, you're shooting aliens and stuff. This is about exploration. This is about figuring out how to get around the environment, finding your tools, and then, you know, noting down where things are so that, okay, right, I can't get through this yet, but I can come back to it later when I get the right bit of kit. And, you know, obviously once you've beaten the game, then it's about using your skills and the equipment and finding an optimized route, as speedrunners tend to do these days. I mean, it's a very well-trodden, very heavily trodden territory for speedrunners for the fact that it's a very mechanically focused game and about finding the right tool for the right job or the right trick to get past it. And in that regard, there's something about it. And the fact that the atmosphere, the environments, it all blends together into this I want to say like dark, twisted adventure, but that sounds very grandiose. Yeah, it's just so different and felt more mature, you know, like less kitschy and cheesy, but at the same token, not over the top with it like Contra or something like that, where it's all like big scary monsters go blah. I mean, there are big scary monsters that go blah in this game. Don't get me wrong, and Metroids are still terrifying. But yeah,
it's you know, a lot of video games were quite, or have been at the time, sort of quite cartoony and stuff like that, and child friendly. And even the games like Contra is a great example where it's more of a realistic design. You know, playing as soldiers, but even then, it's still very video gamey. You know, and just like a fun pastime. Whereas you're right, this is more mature. This is more serious. It's not overly grandiose though, is it? It's very personal almost, and that's kind of what Sherwin, what you said about Resident Evil. That's how I always feel. I've had people say to me before, you know, what kind of games do you like? And I realise there's a lot of those games where it's just like, I just want a little story that's my own. This little isolated adventure. There's something very even though perhaps Resident Evil being a horror game and Super Metroid, you know, not being the most friendly environment to wander around in this alien planet, that's the point. But there's something very nice about that sort of isolation by oneself and just sort of being left to explore and survive. Sherwin, what do you think about the main sort of gameplay tenets?
I mean, Super Metroid to me is, certainly from my experience anyway, and I imagine it's not the first if we can look at the ages of various different games, but this is a survival horror game. Certainly, if you're looking at the concept of survival horror transcending genres, and it can literally turn up wherever it wants to be. You know, you can have a platformer survival horror, you can have a like more traditional Resident Evil approach to survival horror, whatever else. It is a survival horror game in terms of the sense of the thematic of it, and definitely again we'll land on that, I'm sure, and kind of how it works in terms of going to find. In terms of how it approaches things, and it's exactly the same as what Steve was saying. You go out, you search for various different tools or different, you know, like replacement armor or whatever that lets you access certain areas, that sort of stuff. There's a whole bunch of backtracking. You are constantly looking at kind of ammunition. You're kind of tracking what your rockets are doing, your health track and everything else. These are all things which, that's what's in mind as you go through. And what's also really compelling about it, and this is one of the reasons why the sort of thing that drags me into games, it definitely ties into what you're talking about, Si, which is I always feel like Metroid really, really, really does well this idea that you're on your own. And perhaps I'm getting too much into theme here, but you are literally this character that is just walking around your own. There aren't cutscenes, there aren't allies, there aren't buddies sort of following you around or anything else. You are literally isolated. So it's got this really survivalist kind of feel to it. I mean, in terms of the actual raw gameplay, to answer where you're coming from with questions, the closest thing, I mean, I loved Probotector, contra to everybody else, outside of I think the UK, maybe Europe. I'm not sure where Probotector was. I know it was definitely UK. I don't know if we went to Europe that way as well, but I loved that when I was growing up with an absolute passion. I was hooked on that game, and then also Super Castlevania as well, and Super Metroid really ran with both of those games. It sort of mashed them both together with a healthy dose of Zelda as well, in terms of finding different items and that sort of
Right.
stuff. And it kind of mashed together all of those things to the point where young Sherwin, who'd enjoyed all three of those games up until this, kind of found this as the really logical sort of culmination of all of those games. It's like, this is incredible. It's got like, I feel at the time like it's got kind of the articulate jumping sort of element to it of what you had with or tactile kind of jumping elements of what you had with Castlevania. It's got the sort of raw kind of just gun down enemies that you have in Probotector, and then it's kind of searching out different items and sort of feeling smart for kind of overcoming challenges and obstacles that you have in Zelda. With this added element that I wasn't going to realize was really solidified to me until a couple of years later when this game called Resident Evil turned up, of the thematic that really sort of hooked me into it as well. So it just basically for me, I'd actually argue this is one of, I mean, it's not a popular opinion, this is probably one of the better games on the console. And the reason why is because it feels like it just grabs the best elements from so many of those other games, mashes them into this incredible package that really just ticks all of the gameplay things. There's only one thing about this game which I cannot stand, which is the wall jumping. That's the only thing that I land on with this game.
It's going to be ironic, but I actually love the wall jump.
Those three green aliens, man, the amount of times I've spent sitting there looking at those guys, and as I've literally bounced around off the walls, trying to bounce from wall to wall to climb up the sort of the well that you find yourself dropped into, is insane. But otherwise, that's the only thing I can really say about gameplay. Everything else is really solid, feels really, really good.
I'm so glad you brought it up and not me. I think the grappling hook is really, really fun, and that feels. I know you sort of said about sort of like culmination of games in the SNES, and that's so true because this is quite late into that console's lifespan, and this felt so good on that console. Obviously, as I say, I'm playing it on the Wii and something like that, but I've never really played a 16-bit game with sort of swinging mechanics quite like that, where you can go all the way around sometimes, and it just feels really good. But yeah, I completely agree. I know it's a minority thing, get good, me, etc. But I just hate the wall jump. I don't like the screw attack either. It's the game, the sort of. I don't get the negative quite off the bat, but when it gets to that part of the game, it really slows down for me. I've never beaten Super Metroid, and part of it is because I hate those mechanics, and I just find them a bit of a slog to overcome and sort of understand the timing of the jumps and stuff. That's clearly just a me thing, and I need to get over it and get through this damn game, because the amount of times I've started it and never finished it is embarrassing, but I'm really glad I'm not alone on that one. Jordan, how do you feel about the main gameplay of Super Metroid, and how do you feel about the wall jump, since it's a controversial subject, perhaps?
We'll get to the wall jumps and maybe get to some negative points, but I mean, once again, in context, I come to this game, with a largely kind of like fresh eyes on the product.
Mm-hmm.
While I had played Metroid Zero Mission, which I didn't say before, but not only is that a great game, it's a great remake. But it borrows very heavily from both Fusion and from Super Metroid. Although I guess borrowing from Fusion means that you're borrowing from Super Metroid in a roundabout way, anyway.
Right.
But it's weird because obviously that intro is so distinct. It's an immediate tone setter. But one of the things that always kind of sticks out to me is that it comes up with the year that the game was released, 1994. And it's just like, it's not something I've really paid attention to now, but every time I booted up the game to keep playing, it kept hitting me. There was that, actually, 1994, this is not so much a year as it is a brag, because just about everything about this game is ahead of its time. And I was glad I was still able to kind of see that, because I have played plenty of Metroidvanias that are, years beyond this. And it was nice to sort of go back to, what is, considered sort of, the apex of the design, and be able to say, oh, right, that this is where it all comes from, and be able to kind of experiencing it in that same kind of fashion. Not quite like people would in 1994, but as close as I feel I could get. But it honestly feels like such a tight game as far as design. It's so strong, and that's probably why, Sherwin likes to play it when it takes a flight every now and then, because it's something. If a game fits like a glove in that kind of fashion, you want to play it. It doesn't matter if you're playing the first 5 minutes. It doesn't matter if you're just turning it on and playing a stage and then turning it back off again. You happy to just jump in at any point and just play around in that world again. I mean, for me, that analog is probably Super Mario 64, because I can pick that up at any point, and whether I'm messing around with it or whether I'm trying to go for a 120 star run, it feels natural. I don't have to work my way into those games, get used to the controls or anything like that. It just sits right with me, and that's kind of what Super Metroid feels like, because I thought that it would take me quite a while to kind of get into it. I mean, the original Metroid really made you feel like a rat in a maze. It was very hard to navigate such a sort of a vast space at the time, and there's not that issue with Super Metroid. That's one of the biggest strengths, I'd say, is that Zebes, as a place, it's memorable, it's diverse, and the best thing is it strives to make no area feel the same. Even within the different sections, going from screen to screen, there's a wealth of stuff going on, and the next time that you go in that room is going to have a completely different context to the first time you went in the room. I love that. Even today, it's hard for designers to actually be able to pack in that much, especially when you're kind of working with sort of quite a restricted space as Metroid was. But it's very compelling, because at first you just want to get to the next stage, you want to get to the next part, you want to get to the next boss. So it's really smart agency from the game design, that it kind of puts something on the player to think, what if I just go back for 5 minutes?
Mm-hmm.
What could I find if I just backtrack for just a little bit? I've got some new abilities now. Maybe I'll be able to unlock something. And you go from being somebody who just looks at the background as sort of set dressing to, there is a puzzle here for me to figure out. And, it's going to require one of my abilities or one of my weapons. But at the end of it, I usually get a reward. And by the end of the game, you're using the X-ray visor, like it's an occupation. It's just sort of like, right, I'm in a new room. Right, let's check to see if there's anything here to take. And it was doing all of that without me realizing it. It was causing all of that kind of agency that I hadn't had to be prompted by tutorials. I hadn't had to kind of like see that kind of emblazoned on the box. It was more just sort of, this is because you want to do it. This is because you strive to kind of get these extra upgrades or find these extra secrets, because no matter which way you go, there's always going to be something of a reward. And obviously it's one of the key strengths not only of this game but of the series as a whole. I mean, as far as everything else, like the pace, it's really great. Suit upgrades. It always seems to be that you get a suit upgrade or a new weapon right around the time you're just starting to need it. Right around the time you're just starting to get to rooms where you're saying, I could almost make that platform. I just need something else. What do I need? Or you go into a room and it doesn't necessarily seem like it goes anywhere. It's like it will go somewhere. It's just you're not quite ready for it yet. But even though you can get lost, and I did get lost a couple times, it never felt like the solution was too far away. Because I think obviously it would be a bit of a sort of a failure of the game design if it threw you for a loop and you ended up on the other side of the map and you didn't need to be there. I think you have to be doing something really wrong to get lost in Super Metroid like hardcore, because you're usually never too far away from something that you need to be doing anyway. As far as like downsides, I mean, wall jumping, yeah. I don't think it's bad. I mean, to be honest, if you don't encounter the room that sort of teaches you about it, you're either going to learn it by accident or not at all. It's a bit of a kind of a weird sort of hidden ability. But I don't think it's the worst thing. It just has a weird rhythm. And unlike the screw attack, which is a lot easier to kind of get used to rhythm-wise with enough time, I'm still not very good at wall jumping. Because if you mess it up, especially on kind of like quite a tall shaft that you're trying to climb on, if you mess it up right at the top, you don't feel like doing that again.
Yeah.
But you could tweak that. I mean, that's quite similar to the wall jumping in Mario 64, where it's very precise. And hey, if you're tuned in to that timing, it's perfect.
Of course.
But by the time they made Super Mario Sunshine, they needed to refine that wall jump because it was just getting too annoying. They needed something of a window where you could react rather than a kind of a split-second decision. So they could tweak something like that. But as far as my biggest sticking point with Super Metroid, it's probably Meridia as an area.
Mm-hmm.
So you just about kind of visit everywhere twice, with the exception of Turian and the wrecked ship. And so you go to Meridia the first time. There's not as much to do. You're on the lower segments. By the time you come back through, you need to basically flood, most of the rest of the area, and it leads to a whole lot of screens with quicksand, and it just slowed the game down to a crawl for me. Luckily, I did a Google search, and it turns out that a lot of people don't like Meridia for that exact reason. So I guess that's not that controversial. But that was one thing where it's just sort of, it was the quicksand aspect of it, because actually trying to get out of that sand is ridiculously tedious. And it seems to go against everything else that the game's got going for it, because, speed and, just sort of smooth progression throughout the stages and worlds. Yeah, the controls are fantastic. And then all of a sudden it's like you're mashing A, and for a while you almost feel like you're playing the game wrong. You're like, am I doing it right? Is there like a secret to getting out of this quicksand that I just don't know?
That's fair.
Major secret to me. But I tell you what,
it's bizarre that underwater can have quicksand that is so infuriating. I'll fully attest that Meridia is like the most like linear, messy, and poorly designed area of the game. It's not terrible. I think it gets better after you're out of the quicksand area, but until then, it's just pain.
It's a whole lot more rewarding if you go back to it fully upgraded, and you can screw attack through some of those hallways and stuff like that, and actually get to the secrets. But yeah, the first time you're kind of going through the sunken part of Meridia, it just takes a little bit of the shine off, but like not enough to stop me from not going back to that place. In fact, the first time I left it, I was like, right, I'm never going back there. And then it was like, by the time I got to sort of the statue that leads to Torian, kind of like, yeah, maybe I'll go back for, just like a missile upgrade or two. What's the harm? So it says something about how much I enjoyed this game that, one, it wasn't seen as a kind of like a massive detour to kind of backtrack and get a couple of extra bits, but also I was ready to go back to an area that I previously had maligned, because I felt that, well, actually, I can handle it a lot better now. Not because I've necessarily kind of grown as a player and I've figured out quicksand, but just because I'm more powerful as Samus.
Yeah, well, I suppose it's not breaking news to say water level is slow, is it? It's a shame that Super Metroid couldn't avoid that trap. Unfortunately, I agree. It's the weakest area.
It's interesting. I think you even, I mean, obviously it's Metroid, so you gain access to things in different ways and so on. But even the way you actually, I don't know about you guys, the way I first got into that, I remember, is obviously using the super bomb to blow up the tunnel that you're in.
Hmm.
Like, even that isn't obvious in any way, shape, or form. Like, I remember running around for ages trying to work out how to progress, and then just on a whim going, I wonder if I could blow up this, but there's nothing in the game that tells you,
Yeah.
nothing else like that where you can actually do anything like that and interact with your scenery, with the terrain in a similar sort of way. So even that isn't immediately obvious. But I don't dislike that as quite as much as the rest of you guys. I think I can see why it's frustrating. I can absolutely see why it's frustrating. But as a person who grew up with a lot of jumping puzzle type games, that didn't feel so bad. It's pure the jump puzzle. When I'm talking about the wall jump, the reason why that's so frustrating is because it's only that one moment, exactly as you said. It's literally that one thing where you're bouncing off the walls, where the three aliens are down the bottom. Outside of that long shaft that you have to climb out of, you don't ever really use it ever otherwise, unless you're kind of speed running or whatever else. It's just not needed. So yeah, I think that's the thing for me. Like at the time where we'd all grown up with kind of jumping puzzle games, and that was very much the genre, I think it wasn't quite so bad. Whereas obviously game evolution design has moved on since then, and that might be something to do with it.
Mm.
Yeah, I love all these secret moves though, like the wall jumping and the bomb jumping, and technically like the shine spark.
Yeah.
You know, they all allow to do sequence breaking and stuff. So you know, there is pretty much a defined route in which you can play the game. You go down to old Brinstar, go back through Criteria, go through regular Brinstar, down to Norfair, back up Kilcrade, and so on. But when you can use these tools, and you know, if you can master them, it allows you to get around the game in non-glitchy but fully viable ways. I mean, there's plenty of glitches for this game. You know, you watch Summer Games Done Quick or something like that, they tear it apart. But the fact that you can, you know, maneuver around certain environment traps and, like, say, get beams or boots or a suit upgrade early, I think the fact that there is a skill ceiling there for higher level play, but not necessarily the most accessible, isn't terrible. But at the same token, it probably could be more encouraged. I think the tutorial for the wall jumping is absolutely garbage. I will fully attest to that. I think the main trick to it for me personally, this is just purely to try and educate the people in the room, is that when you jump Samus against a wall in a somersault fashion, you then have to quickly pivot the D-pad in the opposite direction and wait for an animation frame as Samus looks basically a unique frame that you don't see anywhere else, and then keep doing that to get up a long shaft. It's tedious for a first-time player. Once you learn it, it's great, but until then, it's just agony, and I think that's why my compatriots struggle with it. So I'm going to engage slug mode.
I saw like the sprite for like a split second. I was like, oh. And then eventually I figured out, well, okay, I'll keep jumping, and then if I see that sprite again, I'll try some kind of button combination. That's how I figured it out, because, yeah, you know, some of those abilities you're only learning in certain rooms, and it's non-verbal. It's like, it's just, okay, watch these little creatures, they're going to do it for you, they're going to show you how to do it, and, you know, good luck.
Yeah.
But it's, even then, it's obviously, it's still tricky. But I will say, you know, as somebody who was playing it for the first time, it didn't really impede me. It was obviously something that would be better to have as a sort of like a natural ability. You know, where, you know, maybe you're just sort of pressing A as soon as you kind of hit the wall, and you're just kind of getting it in a time sequence to bounce back and forth between them.
Yeah,
something like that. But it's obviously it's a very specific you know, ability with a very specific window of time to be able to pull it off. But thankfully, late game upgrades kind of make it redundant anyway.
I think
Did you not to sidetrack further, but did you guys watch the rolling demos that usually play when it shows like the other secret moves, like the bomb jumping and the shine spark, and I can't remember the name of it, but the one where Samus breaks her suit, fully heals herself, and then reassembles the suit?
No.
I didn't know that was a thing.
Okay. Yeah. There's a full restore kind of thing she can do. Involves power bombs and the ammo and some of that.
Oh, I think I have heard of that. Yeah.
Wow.
See, that's cool. You know, as much as maybe my issue with the timing and stuff with the wall jump personally, I do love that there's like a huge variation of visible sort of stuff you can do and stuff that you discover yourself along the way. Like, as Sherwin was saying, that glass tube that you have to smash. Yeah, sure, okay, you're breaking parts of the environment in other rooms, but there's nothing to make you think, oh, I can break this glass. But it is pretty cool to think, especially pre-internet days, discovering that moment for yourself, or hearing about that moment where you super bomb, you power bomb the glass and it shatters. That's like a mind-blowing video game moment when you realize you can do that. And same thing with the wall jump, when you see that sprite and you go, oh, okay, there's something here that I'm not getting, and figuring it out. That's pretty cool, that those sort of things are tucked away in there. And as Jordan said, the sort of willingness to go and explore further and unlock the little puzzles of each room and find all the little extra missiles and energy tanks and stuff like that, which is obviously going to change your experience overall. It's just some of these things are just part and parcel with sort of like the series and the genre now, of course, but you can make this game as hard or as easy as you like, depending on how much time you're willing to, well, how much patience you're willing to have, I suppose, how slowly you're willing to go to seek out every last missile upgrade and every energy tank to make yourself a bit more of a formidable foe. Or of course you can run straight through it, as I'm sure many pro players do. We talked about speed runs. This is a perfect game for it, an early game for speed runnings, and mechanical play and stuff like that. And even just the surface stuff, it's so passe to say, you feel like you're getting stronger over the game. But it feels so rewarding, and as Jordan said, it's so well timed to see an obstacle you can't overcome, go another way, few rooms later you get the new ability, and then you can backtrack and have that eureka moment of how it works and how you get across there. And usually a lot of these ones that are embedded in permanent upgrades are very visible. So like the changes to Samus's suit color, so she can go down into Norfair or through water easier. You immediately recognize that because her suit has changed color. The blaster produces a different kind of firing sprites and stuff, so you understand that something's different there. Just it's immediately obvious stuff like that makes you feel like I'm making progress over what amounts to somewhere between a 3 and a 6 and maybe even a 10-hour game, depending on how long you're willing to put into it. I think that also what I wanted to say was I'm glad that we talked a little bit about Metroid 1 and Sherwin, sort of, you said your early experiences of it being really, really hard with a lack of a map and stuff like that. And Metroid 2 on the Game Boy, I haven't really talked about it, but it's on a Game Boy, so of course it's quite restricted by the hardware. This game is one of those games, because it's a classic, you always get the does it need a remake debate. And I see with this conversation specifically about Super Metroid, more people, perhaps more than any other game, say, no, it doesn't need a remake. It's aged perfectly. Even the blemishes, it's fine. We can deal with it. You don't need to remake this. You might mess it up. Let's just not bother. Metroid 1 and 2, they needed modernizing. Their remakes have been done really well. Super Metroid is 25 years old and it's still just a joy to play. Even all my little issues aside, you feel how sharply the series is, refined to a point here. This is like the magnum opus of, and it's so early into that kind of play style, really. This is before Castlevania sort of rebooted itself. And then from there, of course, the genre's exploded, especially in the last 10 years, of course. So, without how solid Super Metroid is in 1994, the brag, and today still, you don't get Castlevania reinventing itself, and you don't get, modern day indie classics like Ori and the Blind Forest and Hollow Knight and stuff like that. Super Metroid is the reason for all of these things, of course. So let's move on a little bit. I know we want to talk about atmosphere and stuff like that. Usually with aesthetics, we start with visual and then go to audio, but I think we should start with audio this time around. I'll sit back for this one. I mean, I will just say I think it's one of the all-time great soundtracks in video gaming. If you had to absolutely list all of them, this immediately goes on the pile to discuss what the great legendary soundtracks of video games are. Sherwin, how do you feel about the soundtrack and the atmosphere that it produces?
I knew you picked me first.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, from the menu screen onwards, this game has such an incredible statement of intent about it. Just obviously the very much. I mean, I almost said legendary. I'm going to stick with it, having thought about it for half a second. Like the legendary kind of Metroid menu screen opening. Just in terms of the actual, just the opening notes. It's so morose and so kind of it just drips tension, and that's your opening part of this game. You're like, wow, what is this game? Like I'm trapped. Like it really gives you this sense of I am isolated in the middle on my own in space somewhere. I have no idea where I am. It's just so desolate as a soundscape. And then obviously as soon as you start off, you first thing you're kind of wandering very eerie, like through the station and so on. And then you kind of have the appropriate kind of driving for when the self explosion thing happens. And then even when you first land, like when you okay, we're going back down to the planet now. It is just so eerie walking around, and the visuals we'll get onto, but the sound is just perfect for what that is. And then even once you actually start turning on systems and the whole thing sort of really fires up, it's got this really amazing kind of feel of. It's kind of it's slightly upbeat, but enough to kind of give you a characteristic sense for what each location is.
Yeah.
And it also feels like it's just upbeat enough to kind of keep people with shorter attention spans kind of looped in, but not so much that someone who's really there for that sort of isolationist or that kind of desolate kind of feels that doesn't ever truly quite go away. Like you might be running through Brinstar and it's quite, and the sound's quite upbeat or whatever else. You turn a corner and suddenly now you're in Norfair or whatever, and suddenly now it's like, okay, am I like in some old generator or something? Like the music's pulsing at me or something. I'm matching the visuals. Kind of, I feel like I'm in a distinctly different area, and it feels that. And of course, even Meridia, which is very, very Resident Evil Guardhouse. In terms of how that sounds, it's just a really really, really well put together soundtrack. And exactly as you've said, it's one of those ones that just stands the test of time. I don't think there's anything on it that you could really look at and go, that feels odd, or that feels out of place. The closest I guess you're going to go to that, and I don't think it's out of place in the slightest, is probably like the main control room kind of sound where you have the more sort of electronic kind of beeping sort of elements to it. But that just feels like you're wandering around through ancient tech and there's sort of random systems working away still or something like that.
Right.
That just feels like it's, as effectively your safe room sound. That's a nice kind of break or a palette cleanser before you go into a new area. And it's perfectly chosen that can kind of gently fade off into whatever that new area is. So yeah, I can't really add anything to it other than just to nod and say at any one point it does exactly what it's an early one actually. It's an early one for the for that era where game soundtracks started to be increasingly important because graphics and kind of other elements weren't quite there to complete your immersion. So the soundtrack had to do a lot of heavy lifting, and I think it's a early outlier for that stuff. But it does it so well that it's a brilliant accompaniment that really draws you in, but doesn't ever distract you from what the gameplay is. And I think that's probably its biggest achievement.
Yes, absolutely. That piece that you're talking about that plays in sort of like the item rooms and the elevator and stuff it's almost like a transitional piece of music between areas. Palette cleanser is a great way to put it. And you're right, because it serves the environment so well. It's not just music for music's sake. It really just sort of it informs you more about the location that you're standing in, stuff like that. So it's wonderful. Meridia's theme I actually had down as it's pretty underrated. Everyone knows sort of the big belters, the main theme, the Brinstar stuff. But yeah, I think stuff like Meridia gets overlooked in terms of sort of its ambient quality and stuff like that. Steve, how do you feel about the soundtrack for Super Metroid?
I think it's already really been said, but it's fantastic, and it's able to set a tone. I'd argue there's a few clunkers. I'd argue the quote unquote big kaiju monster boss theme for Kraid and Crocomire can go do one. It's just bang, 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 bang. It's not fun to listen to at all. But generally, it feels almost like because the world's interconnected, you can go anywhere you want it. It's kind of like a audio cue to Samus's mindset in my eyes. except for maybe Green Brinstar, which just feels for some reason like funky beats and tribal drums, which then descends into very ominous tones when you get to Red Brinstar and onward. I have no real complaints. I would argue it still gets the odd play now and then on Steve's listening to game music stuff, and Wrecked Ship is probably the weakest. I think if I remember, that's just a low thumping hum when it activates, with a few little weird beeps to it. But Meridia is very much could be a Resident Evil guardhouse, like Sherwood said. It's a haunting little place. Torian, I can't remember if that has a soundtrack until it kicks off. Is it just
it's more like ambient noise, kind of like a low rumbling, if I remember rightly.
So the standouts to me are Lower Norfair, Red Brinstar, the overture theme when you return to Criteria, and it's gone from this weird spooky music to now Samus is ready to kick some bum. So it's all bah, 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 bah,
classic.
with overtures and also all those cool bits and words Steve doesn't truly understand, but is basically saying it's rate good. I'd say the sound.
Just quickly. So we're not good on bar 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 bar, but we're good on bar 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 bar.
Yes, exactly.
I'm with you.
I'm a walking mass of complex. But I wanted to just touch on the sound design itself outside of the music, though, because there's a lot of strength to the little creatures and the chips and stuff that they make, and the sound of the guns. Everything feels decidedly high tech and sci-fi. Everything else feels kind of and on sci-fi shooters in general on the SNES, they feel almost kitschy and B-movie in comparison. In this, there's something just very, I don't know what you'd put it, very punchy, very accurate to the tone of the game.
Yeah.
It's hard to describe.
It's weird. Whoever, did all the sound design for this game clearly had a very clear intent of what they were doing, and that's why it all feels so well wrapped together, because they knew exactly what they were looking at, exactly what they wanted to hear. You're right. Not only does, for me, some choices maybe you're not a fan of the particular songs, but nothing stands out as this doesn't feel like it feels separate from the rest of the soundtrack. Everything feels like it fits together, and that goes for the sound effects as well. Absolutely, it all wraps together wonderfully.
Yeah.
That Samus appearance when you load the game up, that used to be my text tone, to be honest. Even little things like that are just that sort of warm synth. It's just it's like 4 notes, but it's 4 notes, but it's so good. I don't understand.
I was just in terms of just dialing back to my first experiences, that still affects us this day. Although now I listen to it with a kind of twisted enjoyment. The opening title theme is still nightmare fuel. Compared to any other Metroid game since, it's amazing. You should listen to it, preferably for 10 hours on loop.
I'm sure YouTube will be able to help you out with that one. Jordan, how did you feel about the Super Metroid soundtrack? Is it another one for you specifically, I guess, is how much of it were you aware of? Because, as we said, it's a classic soundtrack. It shows up in various YouTube videos and stuff all the time, I'm sure. So was it weird to perhaps hear it in context, or what was it like for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, various tracks from Super Metroid have not only shown up in media, popular remixes, obviously within the Metroid series as remixes, and then probably my greatest sort of exposure to Metroid music remains Super Smash Bros.
Yeah, thought you might say that. Yeah,
there's some incredible arrangements that either put a different spin or tone on those songs, or just do the 16-bit themes justice with a full orchestra or something like that. So obviously they stand up. The music as a whole stands up. I mean, I think this is fair to say that it's an iconic soundtrack by Kenji Yamamoto. It's interesting because it's kind of, as far as the music, it's a bit of a sort of a game of two halves, because the main themes and some of the character themes are more cinematic. They're more sort of conventional, sound more like they're evoking something from a film, like a James Cameron or Ridley Scott film, of the previous decade, back in 1994. And it sets you up just right. you feel like you're really sitting down for something quite epic when you first hear that theme of Samus, and you've got the synth starting, and you're kind of you're getting into some science fiction, but also a bit of horror as well. There's a bit of valiant action in there too. Yeah, all of those different aspects of the game are being kind of sort of summed up with this wonderful sort of opening song. But as far as the actual soundtrack for the game in general, for the worlds and stuff, obviously, when you're going from area to area, there's really not that much melody. You look at the original Metroid, a lot of those songs were more sort of melodic. You could probably hum them, but play them, and obviously that worked fine for Metroid. They needed sort of like a very short loop, and sort of get across something, and it was kind of hard to maybe get the sort of atmosphere that they necessarily wanted back on 8-bit. 16-bit's a completely different game, and this soundtrack, no matter where you are in the world, it's got a real mix of sort of minimalism. It's atmospheric. Often the music actually kind of feels a bit diegetic. It often feels like it's more pulling stuff from the actual backdrop of wherever you are than actually relying on any kind of conventional instruments. Despite the fact that it is quite abstract, despite the fact that there's not that much melody, it's still very memorable, which is quite hard to do. If you are going for something that's an abstract soundtrack that really is doing the narrative work rather than simply being music to kind of add to the presentation. I think the sound design does a lot within its limits to really kind of put across the size and nature of each different area, so that when you do make the drop, through Brinstar for the first time, it really just does feel cavernous. Once you get into sort of like the Brinstar Underground, which is one of my favorite tracks from the soundtrack, all of a sudden, you kind of feel that sort of distance in the music. That itself makes the world feel more cavernous. And nothing's obviously changed that drastically in terms of the presentation, the visuals, because it's just another screen. But it kind of sets you in a different place and says you are quite far away from your ship now, and you're going in a completely new direction, and you don't exactly know where you're going to be led to. And obviously, it does a lot of the sort of heavy lifting with regards to the narrative, because there's nothing really kind of verbal in the game, and apart from a few sort of story moments, almost quasi sort of cutscenes, it has to kind of tell you the stories about these worlds. I say worlds, I obviously mean areas.
Sure.
But going between the different areas and immediately getting the sense of what's going on there. They're like one of the first boss fights in Brinstar, kind of like has that kind of creepy sort of thriller theme to it, where it feels like a bit of an infestation, and obviously feels like a little bit of a nod to Alien, as a film franchise. And then you get to places like the wrecked ship, where it feels haunted, it feels abandoned, and you're almost like I know I'm not going to find anything like living in any of these halls. And that gets across in the music. You immediately feel that you're in a different place. And obviously that's the music doing its job. But it's doing such a good job within the limits of the hardware. It's different now because, if you were making a game now, you can have so much actual, readily sourced sound effects and Foley effects and music to actually kind of hammer any kind of atmosphere. With one-to-one realism, and Super Metroid obviously couldn't do that. But what it does instead is really effective. It's one of the strongest points of Super Metroid that lasts after you play it, because you're still thinking about that music. You're still thinking about what you were doing on each of those screens when that music kicks in, especially when you get a new theme kick in, and you suddenly It's a complete tonal shift, and yeah, it's really strong.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a soundtrack that I often listen to, or just Metroid in general, in isolation while I'm doing something else, or the hundreds of covers and remixes and stuff like that are out there. Shout out to my boys in Metroid Metal, who have made 2 and a bit albums just out of Metroid, music, which is incredible. There's something about I again, not having grown up with the Super Nintendo, I'll always kind of lean a little bit towards the sort of like the funky bass of the Mega Drive sound chip, but I will say sort of this sort of late era of the Super Nintendo had some incredible soundtracks. I think of Donkey Kong Country and what they got out of that sound chip is obviously completely different, for the most part, from Super Metroid, but it's incredible, just showing how deep that sound chip could go. This sort of producing this lush and moody soundtrack. Yeah, it's fantastic. Absolutely one of the high points of obviously what is a fantastic game.
All I ever did was put my all into it, put it all on my back. I never took the fall, now they all want me back. I never got the answers, now they calling me back. Feeling like I'm Santa, got them all on my sack. I did the math on it, I put the weight on them. I grabbed a bull by the horns, I never weighed on them. Now every single thing I do is so sick, I should've stayed home. Somebody better put a mask on them, so I had to come and blast on them. I'm taking no prisoners, only listeners. It doesn't feel right doing something light, I'm only throwing finishes. Bright light, turn your day into night, we came out of that diligence. You done swipe right on a nice fight, got you throwing your dinner up. Now listen up, baby, I know you think you got it all figured out. Check, you know what you're facing till they all in your house. Yeah, you must pay attention, I've been stalling you out. Yeah, what you're seeing isn't real, it's a facade. Now you down for the count. Now you down for the count. Oh, now you down for the count. Yeah, now you down for the count. Yeah, now you down for the count. Now you down for the count.
There's only so many times I can say nobody had quite done anything like this before. But it's true, and it's kind of true of the visuals as well. As we move on, I'm just going to quickly get mine out of the way. it's the little things for me in the visuals I love that make each environment special. You know, you've got your fire level and your water level, of course, but just stuff like the flora and fauna just kind of in the background as part of the locations, you know, really do make it feel like an actual alien planet with stuff like that wandering around. It's not just all dank hallways and stuff like that. And of course the variation therein with actual the wreck shipped hallways and stuff like that, as well as the outside and the underground areas. And the one thing that I just love every time I play this game, I'll just sit for a little while and watch Samus move. Just rather than just a static sprite or anything like that, just the way you can see her breathing because the sprite changes colour and it just so identifiably her sort of shoulders moving back and forth as she sort of breathes. It's like that's a brilliant little touch. Steve, how do you feel about the visual presentation of Super Metroid?
As I've been totally non-biased and fair-handed this entire time, it's pretty fantastic, I'd say. The level of detail, as Size pointed out, is astounding, especially for a mid to late era SNES game. I personally am a big fan of the distortion effects and the way they use Mode 7, but in a non-obnoxious way. They use it mostly for like Ridley popping out of the screen, the ship leaving. I believe it may be part of the grappling hook. Don't quote me on that, though. I am not. You know, I'm sure there's some texture warping malarkey going on that allows Samus to move that way. But most things have a significant amount of detail to them. Even the retread area, the starting area where you go back to old Brinstar, looks nothing like it did on the NES. I think one of my things that I really do enjoy most is when it bleeds over from one area to another. Like if there's any hints or an indication that you're about to go into an area that's particularly unnerving or dangerous, there's normally some parts of the environment to show you're going to be transitioning into a section. For example, the easiest one's the wrecked ship. You see like half of it protruding before you even get near it. Yeah. There's a few rooms in Norfair that are like fully like made out of organic flesh bubbles, and they bleed in from the previous room. And then when you're in that room, they aren't filled with eyes looking at you, but you could be mistaken for believing they are. Every area is distinct. Much as is like I would say, as was the style at the time for the era. You know, each world, as people have called it, is distinct and unique. But they all fit. They all feel like they're from the same game in the same world. They don't like nothing jarringly sticks out. You know, even the opening ship on Sears space station, or Ceres, I don't know how you pronounce it. Zebes, biscuits, whatever. It all feels consistent with the tone it's trying to set. I would argue maybe it's a little dark sometimes. You know, Meridia especially, that falls into there are green rocks and it's bland, maybe. But everywhere else is fairly strong. Kraid's lair is a standout for me because you've got like a dead husk of what I assume is like some larval progenitor form of something, if not Kraid, that you have to crawl through before you even enter the place. It's nice and unnerving. Yeah, it's a fun time.
Definitely. Yeah, I have to agree with all of that. Jordan, how did you find the visuals of the game off of the back of your previous Metroid experiences?
Well, I mean, as a comparison to obviously the Game Boy Advance games, there's been certain advancements that have been made, no pun intended, but still, just this is what kicked it all off. This is the game that kind of prompted all of that design, and still does, not just for Metroid, but for a lot of games. I mean, I think as far as visual goes, it's just about perfect. The sprite work is detailed beyond requirement, to be quite honest. There's certain aspects where it's just kind of like, you didn't need to do that, but we really appreciate you, just putting like, little critters here and there that might scurry off, or like, Samus's visor lighting up at moments and stuff. Little things that you could completely miss and are not important, but are added there because they obviously invested a lot to the actual they invested a lot to the actual presentation of everything, not just from every area, but the sprite work itself, and to make it feel like a living, breathing world, even if you are going through a haunted, wrecked ship. where there's nothing living or breathing. But things like the color palette and the lighting from room to room, it's constantly setting a mood and a tone, and it feels very purposeful, and it's using a full palette. Obviously we said before, Meridia does kind of mute itself more compared to some of the other worlds, but it still stands out as great presentation. The UI is very clean. I mean, just about everything that you need, including a mini map, is right there on the top of the bar. And while that had not necessarily been any kind of new revolution, I mean, there was plenty of games that had most of their information on the top bar of the screen since the 80s, but it still works. And it works perfectly fine to kind of have all of that at a glance. You can go into the pause menu and have a look at exactly what you've got as far as suit upgrades, but you don't really need to. Everything else is pretty much communicated to you through the screen that you're sitting on during gameplay.
Right.
And yeah, there's obviously the other big strength is that the fact that there's so much storytelling that goes on through these rooms. It's much like the audio. It's having to kind of have the task of telling you a story as you explore, without stopping you, without necessarily kind of having major cutscenes or whatever. And it does it so effectively because often it makes you question what's happened here. You kind of feel like you're often exploring an area, and even with enemies, you kind of feel like you're kind of exploring sort of the bones of an area, trying to figure out what's happened here, what's going on, and typically it ends up leading you to the answer, which is usually like a boss, or a new segment that you can unlock and progress and stuff. There's just so much going on that you can really take some time to kind of soak in each screen and see what's been put into it. And I hope I'm not like kind of over egging that there. It's just I really think especially for a 16-bit game, the level of detail that this had in 1994 is superb. And I think it ended up setting a kind of a standard for a lot of the games of the late 90s to follow up on, especially 2D ones, to try and achieve that, so that you feel like you have a world that is instantly recognizable and memorable, and something where if you're then idly exploring, you say, hey, I know this place, I know the way this leads. It's a complete success in that fashion, and it still looks fantastic. I mean, as far as kind of like the question of whether this could do with a remake, I'm gonna say it needs a remake because I don't think it needs a remake. But as far as kind of the visuals, I think even just kind of like upscaling the resolution, it still gets away with looking fantastic, because just about every piece of pixel art is exceptional.
Yes.
So yeah, I mean, I already kind of said perfect visuals, so I really don't really have any negative points. It's just perfect.
Yeah. Started on a big thumbs up, ended on a big thumbs up with that one. Showen, how do you feel about the visuals? Are we all across the board happy with this?
Yeah, I think for me there's a few things. I mean, obviously coming at the tail end, I'm not really going to. I can't really. A lot of what I might think has already been said, to be truthful. I'll just sort of tag on to the end of it. There's so much really smart, clever storytelling, which isn't even the focus of the main story arc. Like, for example, if we talk about where you find the sort of the shell of Kraid or whatever else, or anything along those lines, right before you get to there, you find like another bounty hunter with like a bunch of amoeba kind of like drift off of it or whatever else. And you realize, okay, there's a corpse of like somebody else. It doesn't need to be explained who that might be. Like that's just a corpse that you find like propped up against the wall, and you're like, okay, so I'm it kind of immediately gives the player this sense of others have come before me and failed, or this is a dangerous area, or whatever else. Like right at the start of the game, where you kind of wandering around after you first get on the planet, and the sort of statues kind of they turn to face you as you come down the lift, for example, and watch you, and then as you move around, they kind of their heads follow, their eyes kind of stop and follow you. Really subtle things which kind of you might even miss. but they kind of make you aware of. They kind of make you aware of it's really subtle little bits of storytelling that add to the theme and the flavor, and kind of make you feel like really this has got a lot more depth in it than simply just I'm following the main story beats or whatever else. It's more suggestive things that kind of help to kind of attenuate the sort of mood or the feel that they're going for. Stuff like that is really smart. And yeah, it's obviously a lot of every single sort of sub area of Super Metroid, when you're going through, let's pick a location of your choice, really feels distinct. Like if you're looking for a landmark, if you're trying to find your way through, you can almost navigate by the visuals of the surrounding area you're in. Like you can go, okay, so as I said, this is the green area of of Brinstar or whatever else. I'm running through that. This is when I get a bit deeper in, and it kind of looks slightly different to this or whatever else. All of that stuff, it could be really easy for it to just kind of meld into itself, but somehow it manages to achieve through the visuals this idea that they are distinct areas, distinct rooms. Someone could literally walk straight into a room and immediately go, I've been here before, or this is familiar to me, or whatever else. Like maybe I'm coming at it from a different angle or whatever else. Really smart in terms of how they've put that together, but it's not. They've obviously put a lot of thought in terms of how to actually represent that stuff, but at the same time it feels again seamless like the rest of the game. It doesn't feel like it was a challenging thing to achieve. It doesn't feel like it's something where you look at it and go, I don't know how you guys like this is really forced. It just feels quite natural, and sort of flows, and it doesn't disrupt the experience much like the music. It isn't something where you realize this feels really jarring. It just sort of naturally ebbs and flows. So yeah, I can't. Basically, I'm just bolting on to the end of what everyone said, but I think for me that the interesting point with it is, should it be remade? Is absolutely, and the reason why is, I mean, this is a game that kind of hit a point for when it came to kind of this 2D kind of side-scroller platformer kind of build, and games are now going back to that to try and use that as like a sort of enshrined way of this is how a really good game with that sort of what is now a retro style kind of feel looks like. If that's the case, like any remake you're producing really has to kind of prove its worth by replicating this experience. And if it can't replicate this experience and better it, and all the stuff we've said so far is to the point where that's a really tall order, I wouldn't want to go remake it. I wouldn't want to try and touch that, because that's going to be very, very challenging to achieve and not kind of feel like you fell short in some way, shape, or form, because Metroid smashes everything other than wall jumps out of the park.
Yeah, it's. I almost kind of feel the hesitance for them to do anything like that, because, and this is kind of like a whole separate conversation perhaps, but obviously Metroid is a series that doesn't have too many entries. As we just said, it's been absolutely years since Metroid 4, quote unquote, Metroid Fusion. Now we're getting a new game. It would have been very easy to throw more remakes in there to tie it over, like Zero Mission and Samus Returns. But I do sort of feel some internal hesitance in the same way that classics like Link to the Past, sure, it got a sequel, but it didn't get a remake. It's probably in the same sort of thing where it's like, yeah, there are things you could tighten up here and there, but do you really want the responsibility of handling a remake of such a classic game? You guys... sorry, go on, Steve.
I just want to chime in on the remake discussion in that this game feels more like a framework that has been retrod on, like through Zero Mission and in some ways through Metroid Prime. It feels like we've almost had the spiritual remake just without the full narrative in the transition.
Right.
To me, it seems needless. Like in the same way, you wouldn't have someone go around and say, "Let's remake Mario Brothers 2," except they did on the the Super All Stars game thing. But we'll ignore that for the sake of my point. So that was a texture upgrade. That's what you'd really get. You'd get a texture upgrade, and that'd be it. And the graphics are fine. The sound is fine. I have zero issues with it even today. Like a million billion years since release. Mm-hmm. It feels like, unlike Resident Evil 1, the first game's remake, they did a lot with it and tied it up. Super Metroid, the parts that you tune up don't need to be. Just put it into a new game. Yeah,
it's so true. Maybe my choice of Link to the Past there, perhaps not the best thing. Maybe, Ocarina of Time would be a great example, a game that lots of people love. But arguably, it doesn't need a remake because it is a framework for so many games that are built upon it and tried new things. And by extension, Ocarina of Time does feel a little bit like if you would have to make it 1-to-1 because you would upset everyone otherwise. But then it's kind of like, well, other games have come since and done more with the formula, and that's, since Super Metroid, in terms of 2D Metroid, we have only had Fusion, and we're about to have Dread, and we'll talk about it a little bit at the end. So maybe that doesn't completely work, but it's a similar kind of situation. You guys were talking about storytelling and visuals. There isn't a whole lot on this point, but I will just sort of open the floor in terms of, the story for Super Metroid and sort of how it fits in with the series. Obviously, this is the follow-up to Metroid 2, which, spoiler alerts, for a very old Game Boy game. Metroid 2 ends with Samus leaving the Metroid home world with in fact, Super Metroid opens with it. The galaxy is at peace. The last Metroid is in captivity. So Samus takes that to the Ceres station, as we talked about. And just as she leaves, she gets a distress call, comes back, everybody's dead. And her arch nemesis Ridley has taken the final Metroid back to planet Zebes. I think it's Zebes, actually. And then Samus, lands on the planet and begins her exploration down into the depths. Really, there's no, as we've said over the course of this podcast, there's no dialogue in this game aside from, a bunch of text at the beginning. I think that if you've played the previous games and you know the story, I think that it's a great logical continuation. It's an impactful progression of the story and stuff like that. You get to return to the planet from Metroid 1. You get to expand upon the relationship between Samus and the baby Metroid as well. It's all done with no dialogue. Instead, it's all done with emotion and atmosphere, and the emotion that you feel through that atmosphere. The story is not the focus, though. I think obviously the gameplay comes first. It's more about the journey. But yeah, I guess the big thing is that statue of the bosses, which is boss in every corner, go beat them, is a pretty standard video game trope. But I love that Super Metroid, lets you see that statue and lets you see them crumble one by one if you keep revisiting it. It tells you this so that you can click in your head and you can go, right, okay, I see what I'm doing now. And then obviously beyond that, you feel like, okay, I'm in the end game now. So I'm going to open the floor up. I'm not going to pick anyone in particular, but does anyone have any thoughts on perhaps the story of Super Metroid?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as far as the story, yeah, it is pretty damn straightforward. Because it also happens to be your objective. You get a game over in this game, you see exactly what you're supposed to be doing. Get that Metroid.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're already kind of like from the start screen, you obviously see what is so important about the Metroid. After all, the series is called Metroid, and so you know what you need to look for, and your mission really isn't done until you find it. And yeah, as you say, so obviously there's a very early area where you see obviously the statue, which will eventually lead to Torian, and there's a great little tease to kind of tell you, all right, well, there's a place that you need to go, but you can't get there until you go just about everywhere else and defeat these 4 bad guys. And it gets it all across quite plainly and simply, and you can build off that. It's not something that you need to kind of have like a complex story over, although there is kind of a short sequence where it just sort of catches you up with the events of the Metroid series up to that point. But besides that, you are largely kind of just on one objective, and there's just a lot of things that get in your way. So you just have to kind of work through any kind of obstacle that you have, be it some kind of landmass or be it some kind of enemy. But it's interesting because obviously once you get to Torian, that's when it starts to get a little bit more story focused. And I mentioned quasi cutscenes before. It's because at certain points, Super Metroid effectively kind of takes the control away from you as a player, and does something within the game that partly affects you, but is more to kind of present the next story segment. And it there's very few times that it does this, but it's very effective when it does do it. In part because it's actually involving elements of the gameplay, elements of the UI that you're familiar with, that you've spent hours getting to know. And the first segment that I'd say stands out towards the end is that you have the approach to Mother Brain. So this is before you actually get to the main room with Mother Brain in it, the final boss of the game. And you're going through some hallways which are just specifically for advancing the story. You enter an area which, if I recall, it's largely kind of like made of sand. It's a long hallway of sand. First thing you see is a chorizo. Chorizo, is that how you say it?
Your guess is as good as
Sorry,
mine.
Honestly, I pronounce it how I like. People say Laura Croft, so we can get them back. It's fine.
So,
Samus Aran.
but yes, the living statues that you fight, at certain points in the game, you see one of those staying perfectly still, and even before you approach it, it actually just kind of crumbles to dust. And then a little bit further along, the screen actually stops, so you can't go any further. And you see a side hopper enemy come along and through the screen, and all of a sudden, there's the baby Metroid. No longer a baby Metroid as we saw in the beginning of the game, but this massive Metroid that almost takes up the whole screen. That sucks the life out of this side hopper and then goes after you, but it stops, and you hear its temperament change, and then it just kind of flies off because presumably it recognized you. It's a great little moment, and it's one of those things where if the game was doing it every 20 minutes, just taking the control away and trying to kind of, push in another story segment, it would be annoying. But it was really effective because, for one, first time I played it, I didn't know what was about to happen. I'm seeing my life drain down. I'm like, what is going on? And then the Metroid leaves you with just like one health, and thankfully the next room that you go to has no enemies, and it has the energy refill and the missile refill. After all, you're about to go face the boss. Second segment of this, it's a great ending to a great game, and it's the whole boss segment with Mother Brain.
Yep.
And again, it takes the control out. You basically are obviously just firing as many missiles as you can at Mother Brain, lasting as long as you can. And then eventually, Mother Brain, which is transformed from the first game, is now this awful kind of like big brain T-Rex thing. Fires this gigantic blast at you. Again, saps all your energy, and now the baby Metroid comes back and actually saves you by attacking Mother Brain. Replenishes your health, is healing you, gives you some new fancy RGB powers. And I was watching this, and I was getting so involved in it. It was like, thing is, I knew about this ending, and I was still watching it, and I was still feeling bad for the Metroid. Like I was watching it, I was watching my health go up, and that takes a while. Well, if you've got enough like sort of health blocks, not to brag, but I you see the health blocks go up, and I'm busy watching that. My eyes darting over to the other side of the screen because Mother Brain, which at this point had sort of kind of been frozen to stone, suddenly starts kind of like seeping some smoke, and they're coming back to life. I genuinely had a bit of dread for what was coming because I was like, oh no. And charges another laser beam, goes right through the baby Metroid and destroys the baby Metroid. And I tell you what, considering that you're getting breadcrumbs of the main plot throughout the game, it's really quite sort of threadbare on purpose. I don't know if I'm just the sat for baby Metroid, but that was a genuinely great little narrative moment, and it was a great little sort of finale to Super Metroid. You've largely been playing a game that really the story isn't the main focus. It's about the action, it's about the exploration, it's about your own personal growth. Sorry, again, it's about your own personal growth with Samus. And that's just a great way to end it. And I thought that was engaging and like a wonderful way to sort of say, right, you've fought a long old game. We're going to give you a little bit of a break before you make the escape sequence. And here is a way of kind of effectively kind of closing out the trilogy in a certain respect. To start off with Mother Grade in the first game, to get the baby Metroid in the second, and then the baby Metroid comes back to defeat Mother Brain for good alongside you in Super Metroid. So what story is there is brilliant. It's not constantly being thrown at you, but I think the few moments that they choose to make it cinematic are really effective.
It's really cool to hear your experience of that as someone playing it for the first time. Well, obviously, I've not actually done that myself. I've seen it plenty of times, watching Let's Plays, speedruns and stuff, but I never actually got to the end of the game myself. As I said, just thinking about it, it's almost getting goosebumps. It's really good. It's really powerful, because for all the reasons you said, you don't get that control taken away from you all too often in the game, and when it does, it feels very important. And better yet, it doesn't sort of shrink down to faux widescreen. The top bar doesn't suddenly scroll down with black. You've got your health and stuff on there because that's used as part of the cutscene. We've spoken about in-engine cutscenes and sort of how good they can be, and sort of keeping your immersion, but using your sort of heads-up display like that. Yes, it's very powerful. It's weird to have that feeling about the baby Metroid, considering you've not really even encountered it before, at least not in this game. It's odd, but it's so wonderfully well done. As you said, a great end to a great game. You definitely can't complain.
I distinctly remember, just going back to the start of the episode, that's one of my strongest memories of this game. Again, I'm super young at this point, but I remember kind of almost cheering and pleading for the Metroid to just fly away. I've got much like my friend Cereal Box here. I'm not showing off. I just happen to have all the fuel tanks in it. No, but not quite. But I'm like, I've got my health back. Fly away! Like literally, imagine like young Sherwin screaming at the screen like, "Fly away! They're going to get you." That's how much engaging it was at the time. And the other really cool thing about it is it ends off on a nice point. It basically turns you into Superman. I've got the RGB gun, which is a wonderful description of that, which just annihilates everything, including walls, enemies, everything. Like, it's so powerful when it hits Mother Brain, this all-powerful boss, it blasts her head backwards. And it basically says, you've finished, you've got to the end state of this game, and now you get to be Superman for the rest of the game. Like, for the next 5-10 minutes, you're going to blast through this thing, and nothing can stop you. You've got the most powerful gun in the world. Go. And it just really, really, really fits in well. Like, it's a really awesome way to finish off. And to me, the sort of minimalistic storytelling is... I kind of cite... There's two examples of where you have minimalist... Well, one example of minimalist storytelling, which I think is... Unfortunately falls quite flat on its face. For all the actual world and the lore is brilliant, which is Hollow Knight. Because Hollow Knight has an incredible wealth of lore and a really interesting backstory, but the way that it tells its story, you have to go so far off the course to find that story. It singularly fails if you're playing the game, to the point where you can get to the boss and then not understand why you are here or why you're fighting it, and more importantly, why you've broken the shackles for a boss and then have to fight it instead of just executing it while it's chained down. And it's something where, as a result, as much as I love that game and I really do quite like it, it generally fails at that point. And the opposite end of the extreme of that, which obviously isn't minimalist storytelling, is a Metal Gear game where you run from one room, have a half-hour cutscene, to another room, which has a 45-minute cutscene, and it feels like you're just watching a movie versus actually playing anything. And I think what Metroid does is it has a very minimal story, but it manages to make it... The key moments aren't missable, and they are extremely impactful, and they really, like, the whole focus of the game is working around this idea. You've got this singular focus: find the Metroid, and destroy it, or presumably return it back to captivity. And the whole focus is you're on your own against all these things that are kind of out there to get you. You've returned to the planet, it sets that up wonderfully, kind of nice nods to the original the original Metroid in terms of the surrounding when you first go into the planet. That idea of, hey, you're powering everything up and everything's starting to find you again, being the bosses, watching that statue go and all this other stuff. The whole thing is really, really well done. It really supports the entire thing. So by the time you get to the end and you are seeing the screens like Jordan described, they're perfect. You get to them, and it doesn't matter that you haven't the bit with the baby Metroid. It doesn't matter that you haven't had cutscenes earlier on. Just those bits there are enough to give you a hint of, this is what I'm searching for. I've definitely hit this, and now I need to get out because I've achieved my goal.
Mm-hmm.
There doesn't need to be anything else. There doesn't need to have anything else more complex wrapped into it. And when you do finish it, you don't really feel like you've missed anything. You don't really go, oh, that was a bit of a hollow experience because I could have dealt with more context for why I was doing what I was doing. The whole thing is singularly focused to, very, very focused, go kill this Metroid. That's all it needs to do.
Yes.
And as a result, I think it sums it up really, really nicely.
Passes with RGB colours. I had to.
I just want to quickly chime in because I know my colleagues have pretty much touched the nail on the head about the baby and it's sacrificing its life to save Samus. And I wanted to highlight the some of the other stuff that has been already touched on, but is great, and it's dripping with environmental storytelling. Like there are corpses before bosses, and normally a precursor of that boss. For example, you've got like a baby Kraid before you fight Kraid. The fact that when you enter Brinstar, old Brinstar, and you pick up the morphing ball in the same place it was in the first Metroid, it activates the security system, and then everything whirs into life, and monsters or aliens, whatever you prefer, start appearing everywhere. I think it's fantastic in the way it does this without saying a word. The only words you will ever hear are the last Metroid is in captivity and the galaxy is at peace, and then a few little bits of text at the start, and yet you can find out, that Mother Brain has kidnapped your baby Metroid. At some point, they have broke it out of its canister. They have cloned it multiple times. They have started force-feeding it life to the point where it has become a gargantuan monster. It still recognizes you. Most bosses change their color and hue as you damage them until they die. In the Metroid's case, it goes this color and beyond, so it really is suffering when it is saving Samus, even though it doesn't know it's already fixed her. These kind of like twisted little things that amount to that creature is doing its damnedest to keep you alive, whether you want it to or not. And then you can go and give, Mother Brain the worst case of whiplash imaginable with the hyper beam. It's very simple, really, and for what it is, it's fantastic. I think you could have made it grandiose. You could have had someone on a codec and talking and all these other fancy bits. I'm looking at you, Metroid Fusion, but it didn't need it, and it's perfect without it. Mission accomplished. It's all you. Like as it says, see you next mission at the end of the game. You did what you set out to do, and on that way, you find out exactly what's happened on this planet without words being said.
Yes,
and I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, brilliant. So let's sort of wrap up a little bit on. Try your best to conclude your thoughts on Super Metroid, how you think it fares in terms of the series and the pantheon of video games and its legacy. Steve, final thoughts on Super Metroid?
As I have been very impartial this entire time, with not an elephant, I speak words, Stephen. I have been very impartial this entire time. I've made it very clear that this game has flaws. I am lying, of course. I have a massive heap of nostalgia for this game. But that being said, it truly does live up to its hype. It's a legacy title that, honestly, there's a reason it appears on top 10 game lists still, despite the fact the franchise up until now has been in a coma. It's been on hiatus because of one duff entry. And it's, if you look into the history of Metroid, it's always had a bit of a checkered past. Like, even from the first game, even through the development of Super Metroid, Nintendo were like, they had to push hard to get this game out, the developers. So just to go through all that ordeal and then stand up and be a title that has not only a fantastic title in its own right, it then coined a genre. And, maybe another franchise may have had a hand in making the genre more palatable to everybody.
Sure.
But even Metroid on its own, you've got games like Shadow Complex, you've got Ori and the Blind Forest, not every Metroidvania is a Metroid game. Axiom Verge is another one. It's a fantastic legacy to have, and it's great that it's coming back. I know we haven't really touched on Dread yet, but yeah, Super Metroid is and always shall be in Steve's top 5 games.
Nice.
I can't be objective. I cannot be objective. I apologize. I have not been this entire, be straight with you. I've not really been objective this entire podcast. I've tried to be, but I haven't been.
No,
That's how
I mean,
good this game is.
Who can argue? Who can argue really in terms of what a game to have in your top 5? I certainly couldn't take fault with that. I agree. I think Castlevania had a huge hand in what we've seen out of the last 10 years or so with this sort of genre. Definitely. One thing I would say, perhaps, part of that is, as you said, Metroid's had a weird history. Even with Super Metroid being the smash hit that it was, suddenly we're on the N64 and we don't get a Metroid game because Nintendo don't quite know what to do, sort of transitioning Samus into 3D, so it just doesn't happen. And then when we get to the GameCube, of course, things change completely with the Prime games, which I'm a huge fan of, but obviously it's completely different. So if if timing had been different, or the situation would be different, if we'd have had more 2D Metroids, maybe you would have got more of an impact sooner when there was more variety of games to play. But yes, either way, it all leads back to Super Metroid, I think, in terms of that genre explosion. Sherwin, final thoughts on Super Metroid and the legacy that it has?
It's all right.
It's not good.
No, it's I think I echo exactly what Steve is saying. It's, for me, this is, as I said, this feels like the culmination of a lot of the best possible games that were on the Super Nintendo. It feels like it is something where it's one of those games that comes out late in the console's life cycle, and really just because they know exactly what this console can and can't do at this point. There's been so many other examples of stuff. It just smashes it out the park. For me, it's not difficult to stand head and shoulders above all of the other Metroid games, I think, in the series. If anything, it's a weird entry because it is such a massive classic, and the rest of the series just doesn't hold up in a lot of ways. And that's not a terribly nice thing to say about a game series, but Metroid definitely isn't. Like, if you talk about Resident Evil, you talk about Mario, you talk about Zelda, you talk about, I don't know, Silent Hill, Halo, Call of Duty, whatever other games you want to talk about. These are all franchises that people recognise and go, that's cool, I remember this one, this is great. Metroid is something that's just been cashing in on the popularity of this game and the legacy of this game ever since it came out. And my experience as a kid growing up was, I bought the original Metroid, didn't really think much of it, couldn't get into it, played this, and then went back and played the original Metroid as a result. And then the other games going forward, kind of, people played them because they loved Super Metroid, and then they compared them to Super Metroid and said they're not as good as this. And there's a reason why Nintendo probably haven't returned back to it. It's because trying to beat this, or trying to sort of live up to the legacy it's set it must be a very daunting task, and ones where, was this not fluke? Because obviously the people involved, I'm sure, are extremely talented and clearly had an amazing blueprint for what they wanted to achieve. But future games would have to kind of have the same sort of vision. I don't know whether they can actually do that now, like in terms of how the focus of it is. I mean, I don't know, to be honest. As much as I'm looking forward to Metroid Dread, I genuinely at a stage where I think the logical progression for what Metroid should be at this stage, and what Metroid needs to be, is something that is more like Horizon Zero Dawn. Is my take on where the next place Metroid should go to, rather than this, rather than Metroid Dread, and sort of stick with our roots. And that obviously breaks a lot of different conventions and so on. But then Super Metroid did that, and I think. I mean, it's just, it's a hugely influential game. It is absolutely a game that all of us, with the exception of Jordan, who's only just encountered it, but in 3 years or so, let's find out if you keep going back to it or not. But we all keep going back to it for a reason, because we all really love this game. And it's, even Sai, who can't finish it because he can't go on the screw jump, keeps coming back and plays it.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. my issues with that just sort of subside, and I just think of how great this game is, and I want to pick it up again. As I said, the first time I would have played it would have been late 2000s or something. It was a joy to play then. It was a joy to play this week on the Switch, 25 years after release. My gripes are very minor. I would almost put money down now that in 25 years you play this and it's still just as playable, just as good. I think it is timeless. I think it really will last forever. Any issues that you might have, we've got those issues now. You're not going to find any more. People aren't going to suddenly start picking huge holes in this game. It's going to go down as one of those games that lands in top 100 lists and stuff like that from now until the end of time, as it absolutely should be. Right, so Jordan, let's tie up our conclusions. What was your final thoughts on your first ever experience with Super Metroid?
Well, thankfully it was everything that I could hope it would be. You get to a certain point where if you miss sort of important movies or important games or important albums, you can kind of feel like returning to them, you might have an overcritical eye. You might not necessarily kind of see the same kind of magic that people saw when it first came out. But I have seen it all. I've seen all of the magic of Super Metroid and why it is so successful as a game design, and why it continues to be important. But in a lot of different ways, it was effectively a blueprint for a genre of games that has continued to span over the last 25 plus years. And whether you call it a Metroidvania, whether you call those kind of games search action, whether you call them exploration action, or even simply Metroid-like, it is from this game, from Super Metroid, that so many of those games have been born and had sequels of their own and turned into whole franchises, or even had a complete sort of pivot with regards to their own series to actually spin off and become Metroidvanias themselves. So the legacy is without dispute. It is so strong, and it's obviously it's great that Metroid itself is having a resurgence and there's a new game coming out. As far as sort of this game in terms of is this one of those must-play games? I think it has to be. For how much impact it's had on the industry, it continues, and how much it actually stands up, coming from a completely fresh perspective. If you can play Super Metroid, you should. And the great thing is that as far as all the Metroid games are concerned, it's probably the most accessible at the moment.
Yes.
Not just because it's quite easy to get into, but it's also quite easy to get a hold of. Now, that is one shame about the Metroid series, is that most of those games are not necessarily available on the Switch yet. And obviously, until that time, I would say focus on actually playing Super Metroid. In fact, if you're going to play one game from not only the series, but the genre, Super Metroid still would be my recommendation. It honestly, it hits just about every mark on its first try, which is, genuinely surprising, because even I thought maybe going into it, well, we're going to see a lot of, prototypical kind of designs that eventually get fleshed out, not only in the Metroid series, with the advanced games, but also maybe through the Metroidvanias, like the Castlevania series. But no, it's all there. It's, from the very beginning, the designers knew exactly what they had, what they wanted, and what they were trying to achieve. And they hit on just about every mark, I mean, fix a quicksand, and this is 100 out of 100. But it's damn near close to perfect as it is. And I think it will continue to have a legacy as a game, long after, even the Switch era. But especially because of what it's actually had an impact on, not only as pure Metroidvania games, which upon glance look like them, but just game design as a whole, and how many 3D games have since adopted a lot of the same philosophies in design. So yeah, it's everywhere, and if you've enjoyed just about any game in the last 25 years, it's probably got some fingerprints of games like Super Metroid on it. So go check it out if you haven't. I mean, if we haven't spoiled it for you too much, go check it out.
I don't think there's any excuse, really, especially if you're a Switch owner. Even if you have never played it and listened to this, I don't think we can spoil the full experience of it, really. So yes, if you've got Nintendo Switch Online and it's a pittance, Super Metroid is immediately available for you. So you should absolutely go and play it. So that is actually going to wrap the Super Metroid discussion. As we kind of made a bit of a mention to, there is one last question. I just wanted to check everyone's hype level for Metroid Dread. As I said, this is the first 2D Metroid game in 19 years, discounting remakes, which is pretty special indeed. Bit of a surprise announcement as well. Of course, we've been waiting on Prime 4 for a long time. And this kind of being announced at E3 this year was a complete surprise. I'm sure at least 50% of us have got it pre-ordered. I know I have. I'm very, very ready for it. And I'm curious because you said about obviously taking the series in a different direction. I don't recall if you played the Prime games or not or anything like that. Obviously, those are a huge departure. I wouldn't be opposed to trying something new. Maybe I'm just kind of like, oh my god, a new Metroid game. I'm happy enough with it as it is. But how do you feel? I know you've mentioned it a little bit previously, but are you ready for Metroid Dread? Are you going in open-minded? Obviously, it's not going to necessarily live up to Super Metroid.
Well, I mean, I'm certainly part of the pre-order gang for Metroid, Metroid Dread, so that's cool. I think as unfortunate as this comparison will be, I am absolutely going into this with Super Metroid in mind because I think it would be silly not to. You can't really look at any game like you couldn't play a Resident Evil game and let's say a new Resident Evil was announced, Resident Evil Township, sort of maybe Big City, whatever we want to call it, the new one. I don't think you could ever approach that without having the other Resident Evils. And I don't think especially it's a 2D side scroller, or from what looks to be anyway, in terms of what it is, or at least a 3D side scroll, whatever the appropriate term of it is. It's going to have inevitable comparisons with Super Metroid, and I think it's going to be something where, knowing the attention that sort of Nintendo tend to lavish on these big titles like this, I really am looking forward to it being a real successor to Super Metroid. Because otherwise it's something that says, well, why did you bother release it if you went to go all the effort from releasing a game you can't top something you made back in 94? Like, where's the point in releasing anything beyond that, if that makes sense? Like, you should really be, every game that comes out should really be pushing it that much further, should be, in some capacity, should be the next best thing you released. Otherwise you're just sort of going backwards and sort of looking back and going, yeah, this is not really where I want to. So I definitely think that. Yeah, I mean, that's my honest take on it. And as much as I've just said about it could go in a different direction, I'm excited to see what they do with this one.
That's fair. I've played the remakes of 1 and 2, and I enjoyed them well enough. But obviously, the last 2D Metroid game is probably the one that lands at the bottom of the pile for most people. I know that's not necessarily true of everyone, or even necessarily true of everyone here. But Metroid Fusion, we talked a lot about how Super Metroid does so much by saying so little, and Metroid Fusion is often kind of lambasted for doing sort of the reverse, saying too much and being a bit linear. I enjoy it well enough, but it's definitely not one of my favourites, so I'm excited to see a brand new non-remake game and see what direction they go with it. I'd prefer it obviously to be closer to Super Metroid's sort of system, and I'm excited to see, because it's the same studio that worked on the Metroid 2 remake, and that was pretty good, going off of the basis of that game. So I'm excited to see what happens when they're perhaps given a few more keys to the kingdom, to see, just to try new things and just to see how it works out. So, it being so long since Metroid Fusion as well, we really have no idea exactly what we're getting into. I'm very open-minded. I'm very excited, and also, I think I tweeted it, but my first reaction to it was, we've got like stalker-like enemies in Metroid Dread. How have we not had that previously? How's that not been a thing in Metroid? Like, it seems like a perfect fit. Steve, I think you're a fan of Metroid Fusion, aren't you? How are you feeling about Dread?
As long as it learns the lessons from Fusion and it doesn't stifle it with a excessive narrative, it should be a good fun time. Like you said, the people who made Samus Returns made this, and I think if anyone was worthy to pick up the bat, it's either these guys or Retro Studios. But obviously, Retro Studios are meant to be busy with Prime 4.
Right, so we got both of them working on Metro games, so that's pretty great.
Yeah. Looking at it in purely objective standpoint, it will never probably live up to my expectations for a Super Metroid sequel. But at the same token, their bar has been missed so far and so low before that already from what I've already seen, they get it. They're taking even things from like Smash Brothers Samus and incorporating it into a 2D moveset like counter blow moves and all these other cool little things. I don't know if I'm sold on the design of the Emmy things. They look a little too Portal for me compared to the aesthetic of the universe. But otherwise, I'm on board. Like, I don't know if it's going to blow my socks off, but I know I'm going to have a good time. If that makes sense. The fact that Metroid's even back in the true sphere of things. And from the snippets, I think, of one of the boss fights, I think it is, where Samus does like these cool little poses and things. They clearly have they're clearly on my kind of rule sheet for what they see as Samus's character rather than other M. As in, the stoic badass as opposed to whatever the heck it was in other M. And just that alone is good enough for me.
Yeah, that's fair.
So I have pre-ordered it. I'm excited. I don't expect to be disappointed. I'm just waiting to see how much I'm going to enjoy it.
Yeah, I've I can see where you're coming from with the sort of GLaDOS robots, definitely. But it does seem to sort of fit in with the rest of what we've seen out of Dread and what we've seen out of sort of Samus's new design. I don't know if there's been a reason to explain her sort of suit design, but I tell you what, I'm actually shockingly into this sort of like white and blue. I pre-ordered the amiibos. As I said, sort of I referenced it at the beginning of the show. Jordan was like, oh, they're available. Pre-order them, and then if you don't want to have them in the end, you can always cancel your pre-order rather than regret it later. At this point, I know I'm just going to get them. I want that fancy new Samus to go with my my other Metroid amiibo collection that seems to be gathering. Jordan, how do you feel about Metroid Dread? Excited?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, from a standpoint of where I am at with the Metroid series, it's been a real Metroid year, and it was. I didn't start on this with the intention of it obviously culminating in Metroid Dread. I'd already started playing through some of the games when all of a sudden Metroid Dread is announced, and it's like, well, now I have to finish the rest of them. Now I need to go play Super Metroid. Now I need to go play Metroid Fusion, which will be my next stop. In between now and when the game comes out, late October, I think it is.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm really looking forward to it, and I think I'm happy that Metroid is in such a great place. With the series, it's a case of when it rains, it pours in terms of actual content. But otherwise, it is like a desert, a massive, wide, dry as dry desert, because you just don't get anything for years, and then you might actually get quite a bit of a sort of a landfall of different games that all of a sudden just pop out of nowhere, and that's kind of what the case is here. So, to anybody who obviously is interested in Metroid series, make the most of it right now. This is the most important time for the games to be picked up and played, because ultimately Nintendo does kind of lose interest after a few years and kind of drop it. So the more successful these games do, the more Metroid we're likely to see in the future. I mean, I think it's just, as a whole, I think the series is in a pretty good place. It wasn't the case a few years ago. I mean, when you had Other M,
Federation Force.
Yeah, it looked pretty bleak, because it just looked like, Nintendo could not power themselves through any kind of decent ideas they could come up with for Metroid, and it was, pretty upsetting. You had Yoshio Sakamoto, who had finished Metroid Other M, was heavily involved in that. The backlash from that game and the criticism from that game almost forced him to basically step aside from Metroid altogether. Instead, we ended up having a studio like Mercury Steam, who again could have went in a completely different direction after their maligned, although I think that there's at least some quality to it, Castlevania Lords of Shadow trilogy. Suddenly got involved and were able to actually take on the role of remaking Metroid 2, a long overdue remake right there. So you've got a studio that, in this day and age, could have just gone defunct. It could have, depending on whoever had the ownership, whichever publisher was in control of that studio, they could have just been shelved. Instead, they kind of bounced back from Lords of Shadow 2 and, picked up, one of the most iconic Nintendo franchises ever, to bring back a long overdue remake to a series, and team up with Sakamoto, who takes a producer role. So it feels like all the pieces are coming together for something that certainly looks very positive. I understand the criticisms with regards to, maybe the new look and maybe the new enemies, but obviously it's worth remembering that the thing is, much of the Metroid games that we have played and we've known kind of, had a lot of their ideas born, from at the very least 20 years ago, and far more than that, going back. This is all brand new. This is past Fusion in the timeline. I think this is past just about everything, if I'm correct.
Yeah.
So we're going in a completely different direction, and new isn't always seen as good on like the first take when things initially come out. I'm going in with as open a mind as possible. It's probably easier for me to do because I'm getting into Metroid quite late, so a lot of this is fresh anyway. But for people who are maybe still a bit on the fence, I don't think there are many people like that, to be fair, with Metroid, because I think you're just happy with what you can get.
Right.
But yeah, just give it a chance, because I think that they are tuning into the strengths of Metroid. I mean, the one thing that I absolutely love and really needed to be a factor was the speed of the game. It looks so smooth, and the fact that you can constantly kind of move from screen to screen with such ease really kind of gives me hope that they're really tapping into what's important about the pace of a Metroid game, and not getting themselves bogged down the way that especially Other M did. It's all encouraging points. So excited for, what could be a big era for Metroid, depending on how well Dread does, and depending on what kind of direction they want to take. We've got Prime 4 somewhere on the horizon. Whether it comes out on the Switch or not, I don't know. It might be the next system. But fact of the matter is, if you are a Metroid fan, the good times seem to be coming back, and make the most of it.
Yeah, I think you're right in that. Probably don't need to tell people this, or just don't need to necessarily start waving the flag. Everybody already knows. But of course, if you're a Metroid fan, you should have this pre-ordered. You should buy it as soon as possible to show Nintendo that they should probably care about more Metroid games in the future. Because if Dread isn't necessarily the greatest thing since Super Metroid, you never know. Maybe the next one could be. It's just important that we enjoy the games that are coming, and hopefully more come, and we don't just wind up waiting another decade or something, as you sort of mentioned there. But nothing else remains for me but to thank our contributors and our Patreons once again. Support the show for as little as $1 a month to help us create more bonus content like this one over at patreon.com/FASprayPod. You can also join the Discord server to get in touch with members of the team and our community, discuss Resident Evil with us and other fans, and listen to the podcast live as it's being recorded. You can find a link to the server as well as our Twitter, Facebook, Twitch, Instagram, YouTube and more at faspraypod.com. You can find the podcast on YouTube, Stitcher, Spotify and iTunes, and if you enjoy the show, please do leave us a review where you can. It helps spread the word. Thank you to the panel. You can follow all of the Pueblo people individually. I'm at Syniac_123. Steve is at FB Steve was taken. Jordan is at Serialbox64, and Sherwin is at Sherwin's Agenda. And finally, thank you for listening, and have a good week.
Are you still recording, Si?
Yes.
I didn't want to bring this up until the very end so that it might be easier for you to just sort of edit in. There was one thing that we kind of missed and probably wouldn't be able to get away with releasing without talking about it, and that was if you wanted to cover the bosses at all.
I mean, it's already about 2 hours long.
Maybe we'll do a redux. We'll go back to it.
Yeah, we'll do the direct.
I mean, they have like very telegraphed attacks, which helps, and they normally have obvious pain states, with the exception of Fantoon, who's a pile of Ridley's a straight drag out proper final boss fight, and Mother Brain is more of a cutscene sequence that is a fantastic set piece. There we go, we're done. Job's good.
Also, a glorious end. We can literally fade out the episode and then just go into. I'm totally with this, and we should probably leave it in.
Fade down, go into Steve Boss rant. Got it.